Baker, a great profession. Perhaps you're just embarking on a career in the baking trade or have recently started making bread. Bread is a multifaceted product. It is consumed by people all over the world. Whether you work in Europe, Africa or Asia, wherever you go there are bakers just like you baking bread on a daily basis. This film is for you as a baker and is about bread and preparing bread. The film is intended to be a tool to enable you to practice your profession with even more knowledge and expertise. When you enter this bakery, you are immediately struck by the great variation in the types of bread on offer. There is white bread, made from the innermost part of the wheat grain, and brown and wholemeal bread, for which the outer part of the grain is also used. Bakers frequently experiment with decorating the bread's crust using different sorts of seeds. Bread can be baked in a mould or on a baking sheet, or it can be baked on the hearth of the oven. It can be long or round. You can choose between rolls weighing 40 grams and bread weighing more than 1 kilo. And the crusts differ too. There is soft bread with a wafer-thin crust and crusty or hard bread types with a thicker crust. The range also includes croissants. We don't refer to these as bread, but more and more shops are selling them. This extensive range of bread can be found in any one bakery in any particular town in any country. Not only does each country have its own specific range, but each individual baker supplements this with his own variations. It is clear that bread is a hugely varied product. You may wonder if all these different types of bread still have anything in common. They certainly do. Bread has a number of properties that can be found in every type. A typical property of bread is its airiness. On average, 1 kilo of bread has a volume of 5 litres, with some exceptions of up to 8 litres. This produces a compressible soft crumb. Not only is it compressible, it springs back almost completely, slowly but surely. Another property of the breadcrumb is its good cohesion. In other words, it doesn't crumble. Despite the substantial differences between types of bread, there is much in common in the way in which they are prepared, or rather in the preparation steps. The following preparation steps occur frequently: selecting the recipe, weighing the ingredients, mixing, fermenting, dividing, rounding, proving the rounded dough, the moulding, final proof, baking. Here is a short demonstration of these different steps. For each type of bread, we assume one recipe is being used. The ingredients have to be weighed and mixed to form a cohesive dough. The dough has to be divided into portions, each portion for one individual loaf of bread. After it has been divided, it is rounded. While the rounded dough is proving, the yeast becomes active, causing the dough's volume to increase. After this proving, the individual pieces of dough are shaped. Once the dough has been shaped, it is left to prove again. Finally, the portions of dough are baked. All these steps will be shown in detail in this film for both hand and machine processing. But let us start with the recipe. In the bread baking trade, recipes are preferable expressed in terms of the quantity of flour. What do we mean by this? In the recipe, the flour is stated as 100% and all the other ingredients are calculated as a percentage of the quantity of flour. A recipe for a specific type of bread reads as follows. Instead of percentages, we can also express this recipe in kilograms. This makes no difference to the notation. In this recipe, 3 kilograms yeast, 2 kilograms salt, and 53 kilograms water and 2 kilograms bread improver is used for the 100 kilograms flour. Because 1 kilograms water is equivalent to 1 litre water, you can also say 53 litres water. The advantage of this way of working is that you can see at a glance how salty the bread will be. 2% salt makes a fairly salty loaf of bread. You can also see whether you can expect the dough to be soft or stiff. 53% water usually gives fairly stiff dough. The quantity of yeast tells you something about the length of time the dough will need to rise. We will come back to bread improvers later. From the basic recipe, it is also easy to calculate how much of each of the ingredients you need for whatever quantity of dough you want to make. This method of notation also makes changes to the recipe more systematic than does any other method of notation. Here we change the quantity of water from 53 to 58%. This will produce softer dough. Let us now take a closer look at the various ingredients. Of all the ingredients, the flour is the most decisive for the bread's quality. Here we see 2 loaves of bread made from the same recipe and according to the same method, the only difference being the different qualities of flour. The loaf on the right has been made using good quality flour, so-called strong flour. It has good volume, a soft breadcrumb, and is not crumbly. It does not go stale too quickly when it is stored. The loaf on the left is made from weaker flour. It has less volume, is not as soft, and is more crumbly. It is therefore very important to choose the right quality of flour for each type of bread. Yeast also plays an important role. When the bread is left to prove, the yeast converts sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide ensures that the dough rises and increases in volume. In principle, we can choose between fresh yeast with a high water content and dried yeast. Each of these 2 yeast sorts comes in different types. The most commonly used fresh yeast is the pressed yeast that comes in blocks. It is usually crumbled into the dough. These days, liquid yeast is also often used. This is the same yeast with a higher water content than the yeast in blocks. When adding yeast to the other ingredients, it is important to make sure that it does not come into contact with the salt or only does so for a short time. Contact with salt makes the yeast inactive. The most frequently used sort of dried yeast is the instant dried yeast that comes in fine corals. Here too there are special instructions for adding it to the other ingredients. Avoid direct contact with the water because this causes a substantial decrease in the activity of the yeast. For this reason, the dried yeast is added to the dry flour before the water is added. Traditionally in the baking trade, other ingredients were also used in addition to the main ingredients of flour, water, yeast and salt. Classic additions are fat, sugar and malt flour. These increase the bread's softness, cohesion, taste and storage life. Today, these and other auxiliary ingredients are usually added in the form of bread improvers. There are powdered bread improvers, paste bread improvers, and bread improvers in cream form. These days, there are increasingly more liquid bread improvers. Contrary to that which the name implies, these bread improvers do more than simply improve the quality of the bread. It begins with the mixing of the dough. Bread improvers increase the mixing tolerance. This means that the duration of the mixing process has less effect on the quality of the bread. The dough is also resilient. It is also more resistant to mechanical damage, which can be inflicted later on during the processing. The duration of the fermentation process also has less effect on the quality of the bread. In other words, you can opt for a shorter or longer fermentation process. The bread is airier, the breadcrumb finer and softer, and it stays soft longer. Improvers therefore have a positive effect on bread preparation, in addition to improvements in the quality of the bread itself. Bread improvers come in many different forms. The most well-known is the powder improver. There are also paste and liquid improvers. The dough can be mixed by mixing machines. These machines have a large variation in mixing intensity. A traditional mixing machine, as shown here, has a low mixing intensity. There are usually 2 or 3 speeds, for example of 30, 60 and 90 turns a minute. To ensure the dough is properly mixed, it will need 25 minutes at high speed. A spiral mixing machine has a greater mixing intensity. It has 250 turns a minute. With this sort of mixing machine, you can mix dough in approximately 10 minutes. In some countries, they use so-called high-speed mixers. These are mixing machines with an extremely high mixing intensity, which can mix dough properly in just 2 or 3 minutes. In other words, before you start to mix, you must be sure of the intensity of your mixing machine. All types of mixing machines produce good dough. For our mixing demonstration, we have chosen a spiral mixing machine, which gives a somewhat more intensive mixing. Our dough is made on the basis of 10 kilograms flour. We start by weighing the ingredients. 10 kilograms flour, 200 grams salt, 300 grams pressed yeast, 300 grams bread improver, and then 5.5 litres water. The first mixing stage is called the crumbling stage. This is done at low speeds to limit the amount of flour that gets blown around. After about 2 minutes, the ingredients are mixed. Individual ingredients are not, or virtually not, distinguishable. The dough is still very short at this stage, meaning that it is still fairly crumbly. It also sticks to the side of the mixing bowl. This is when we turn the mixing machine to high speed. This stage is called gluten development because of the gluten. We will return to this later. During this stage, the cohesion substantially increases. It is more difficult for the mixing arm to turn in the dough. This is clearly seen when the amount of energy used by the mixing machine is measured. The energy use increases rapidly once the ingredients have been crumbled. Now you will observe how the dough lets go of the sides of the mixing bowl. At a specific moment, the dough is ready after mixing at fast speed for 8 minutes. We check that it is ready by stretching a piece of dough in 2 directions so that it forms a film. This traditional method remains the best way of seeing whether the dough is properly mixed. Now we will demonstrate what is meant by gluten. A piece of dough is rinsed in a jet of water, producing a sort of chewing gum-like mass, gluten. The quantity of gluten in the dough reflects the quality of the flour with which the dough has been made. The development of this gluten is easily the most important process during the mixing stage. We have not finished with mixing yet. We still have to deal with 2 important questions relating to mixing. What do we have to do to reach the required dough temperature? And how do we get a good dough consistency? The temperature of the dough we just made was 27 Celsius, which was exactly what we intended. The choice of dough temperature mainly depends on the temperature of the ambient. The rule is that these two must not differ too much. We achieved this dough temperature by measuring the temperature of the flour and adjusting the temperature of the water in line with this. The water temperature is calculated as follows. During the mixing process, the temperature of the dough rises as a result of the frictional heat. Here we are measuring the increase in temperature during the mixing process. It ranges from approximately 20 to 25 Celsius. We continue mixing until the temperature reaches approximately 27 Celsius. A 7 Celsius temperature increase is usual. For a targeted dough temperature at the end of the mixing process of 27 Celsius, the average temperature of the ingredients at the start of the mixing process must be 20 Celsius. The temperature of the flour was 21 Celsius, therefore the temperature of the water must be 19 Celsius. If you do all this properly, you don't have to mix for a specific period of time, but you can simply stop as soon as the dough temperature reaches 27 Celsius. For an uninterrupted production process, it is important that each batch of dough has an even temperature. A good dough consistency is also important for an uninterrupted production process. Achieving this is usually not very demanding. If you use your customary ingredients and good scales and measuring equipment, you can simply mix all the ingredients together at one time. But if you start on a new consignment of flour, or you do not have accurate scales and measuring equipment at your disposal, it is advisable to retain a small quantity of the water. Halfway through the mixing process, you can assess the consistency and, if necessary, add the remaining water. To conclude this section about the mixing process, we will address one more method. In the previous example, all the ingredients were mixed at once. Another method involves the mixing of part of the ingredients before completing the mixing of the dough as a whole. In this example, all the flour, yeast and water are mixed together to form a homogeneous mixture, so-called sponge. This method entails a short mixing process. The mixture is then left to ferment for 30 minutes. After which salt and improver is added and the mixing of the whole dough is completed. This method is applied for all sorts of purposes in various compositions throughout the world. Even if only because of the time it requires, the fermentation process occupies a dominant position in the bread preparation process. Of an entire process of about 3 hours, at least 2 hours is taken up by the fermentation process. The formation of the carbon dioxide gas causes the dough's volume to increase during the fermentation process. Here you can see this occurring while the rounded dough is fermenting. In 45 minutes, the gas volume of the dough is more than doubled. Here you can see 4 types of fermentation processes. The first is the fermentation that takes place after the mixing of part of the ingredients as described earlier. Part of the ingredients is left to ferment in the mixing bowl. The duration of this varies from some dozen minutes to a number of hours. A second form is the fermentation of the whole dough, often in the mixing bowl, but sometimes also on the work surface. Here too, the duration lasts between some dozen minutes to more than 1 hour. The third form of fermenting is the fermentation of the rounded dough. This is the fermenting of a piece of dough for an individual loaf of bread before it is given its final shape. In small bakeries, this is done on the work surface, with the portions of dough being covered. In larger companies, this takes place in an overhead prover. And then we have a final prover. This takes place after the dough has been shaped and before it is baked, and usually takes about 1 hour. For bread baked in a tin, the pieces of dough are placed in tins. The tins are then placed in final proving cabinets. These have a high temperature and a high level of humidity. For floor bread, the final proving takes place on automated deckers. Some pieces of dough are sprinkled with seeds or some other sort of decoration. For other bread sorts, such as you see here with small bread, the final proving takes place on oven trays. Various processes occur during the fermentation stage. This is when we observe one of dough's major properties: its stickiness. There are 4 ways of preventing dough from sticking, all 4 of which are frequently used. The easiest is to dry out the top of the dough. This is done, for example, in an overhead prover within which the conditions are fairly dry. A dusting of flour is very effective. Sometimes this is done with rice flour. Here you can see this being done during the dough division process. Water is also used to prevent the dough from sticking to work surface and hands, for example, when taking the dough out of the mixing bowl. Finally, oil is also used to prevent sticking. The application of oil or emulsion to baking trays or sheets is very common. Oil or emulsion is also used for greasing the dividing machine. In the following section, we will show you the most common processes that take place during the fermentation process. In the first place, this is the dividing of the whole dough into portions for individual loaves of bread. In small bakeries, this is done by hand, usually using weighing scales. In larger bakeries, this is done using dough dividers. The manual division of dough for small bread is usually carried out in 2 stages. Here, dough is being divided into 30 portions for small bread loaves. First, dough to be divided into 30 portions of dough is weighed. After this, the dough is divided in the divider, usually after it has been left to prove. This machine is primarily used to round the dough. We will show this later. Here it is only being used to divide one piece of dough into 30 smaller portions. These machines come in various different sorts and sizes. Larger bakeries use dividing machines, which, depending upon their capacity, can put between 2 and 8 pieces of dough onto a conveyor belt. Here, the pieces of dough are divided and rounded in a single process. The processes for dividing and rounding the dough nearly always occur directly one after the other. Here you can see this being done manually. Rounding is a typical process in a bakery. Its purpose is not only to obtain a manageable form, but to make the dough resilient too, meaning that a degree of tension is given to the dough. Here you can see the difference in consistency between dough that has been rounded and dough that has not. It is important that the dough is given the right level of tension to give it just enough pressure with the ball of the hand. A firm dough should be loosely rounded up, a moist dough firmly. You can also complete the process in 2 stages. This technique is also practicable for larger pieces of dough. When a rounding cupboard is used, the rounding is carried out on a conical rounder, whereby the pieces of dough are rounded in a trough surrounding a moving cone. Small bread is also rounded once it has been divided. Here, this is being done by hand. It usually takes place at the same time as the dividing in a single process in dough rounder dividers. A process that is not seen very often anymore in the modern bakery is the punching of a piece of dough that has been left to prove. Here you can see this being done by hand to a whole piece of dough that has been left to prove on the work surface. This can also take place in the mixing bowl with a few punches from the mixing arm. Finally, portions of dough are moulded or shaped. Here we see how a portion of dough for a loaf of bread is shaped by hand. First, the rounded dough is shaped into a trapezium. This is then firmly rolled up, whereby in particular the end is well stuck. The use of a small rolling pin often results in a better shape. A moulding machine usually gives a better shape than when done by hand, as well as a more regular breadcrumb. The use of a machine, therefore, also has advantages with respect to quality. First, the rounded piece of dough is rolled out into a square-shaped pressure board. This is then firmly rolled up and then rolled lengthways under a pressure board. In this way, all sorts of shapes can be moulded either by hand or using a machine. Once the portions of dough have been moulded, they are left to prove for the final time. Some types of bread are treated before being baked. For example, incisions are made. The dough is then baked. We will show a number of examples of baking processes. We will start with the baking of bread baked in tins in a deck oven. The temperature of the oven is an important factor. This must be hot enough to ensure that the bread has a good colour at the end of the baking time. This bread baked in a tin is baked in a deck oven at 230 Celsius. It is also important to add steam during the early stage of the baking time. This gives the bread a good crust after 35 minutes in the oven. This can be achieved for soft, small bread at a temperature of 280 Celsius after 8 minutes in the oven. Bread can also be baked on the heart of the oven. This gives a more attractive crust than when the bread is baked in a tin. Here, automatic deck equipment is being used, but a hand decker can also be used. And in this rotating rack oven, the temperature of the oven is regulated by a computer. Starting at 250 Celsius and 10 seconds steaming, here you can clearly see how the tins become wet from the steam. After 10 minutes, lower the temperature to 210 Celsius, open the steam exhaust valve after 20 minutes, and the bread is ready after 36 minutes. Bread is a varied product. Each type of bread is different from another, and yet there are still many similarities in the way in which each type is produced. This film has introduced you to all the stages in the production process. It is important that these stages be followed in detail in order to bake a tasty loaf of bread. Thanks to your professional and dedicated effort, consumers throughout the world are able to eat good, tasty bread. We wish you much craftsmanship and pleasure in practicing one of the best professions in the world.